From the magnificent Midwest, this is the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week when we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives regarding men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you in part by Let's Get Real, where forensic accountant Tiffany Couch uses her financial skills to shine the light on the real issues we all face every day. If you'd like to make decisions based on facts rather than on feel-good rhetoric and on cultural pressures, go to letsgetreallife.com, a place where you can find tools to improve your communication skills and to increase your connection to humanity. That's letsgetreallife.com. Today on the show, we're going to talk with sociologist W. Bradford Wilcox on the myth of the soulmate. But before we do, a couple of quick announcements. As some of you know, I've moved the Suzanne Venker Show from the Hair Saloon corporate offices to my home, and I'm in great need of patron support. Podcasts are a great way to push back against the lies the culture tells, but I need your help. Just go to thesuzannevenkershow.com and scroll down until you see the Become a Patron button, where you'll find 4 very economical levels as well as free gifts for signing up. And if you have a business you want to promote, there's even an option for that. And a quick shout out today to Emily and Paul. Thank you both so much for becoming a supporter of the Suzanne Venker Show. Also, don't forget to check out my brand new shop page at suzannevenker.com, where you'll find my new ebook, How to Be a Wife, 7 Secret Steps to a Peaceful and Passionate Relationship with Your Man, as well as the new Suzanne Venker Show mugs. Mugs. Everybody needs a mug. You don't want to listen to the show without drinking coffee, and you need a mug to drink it out of. So head on over to the shop page and get yourself a Suzanne Venker Show mug. Finally, if you or if someone you know needs a marriage mentor and you think we'd be a good fit, just go to my website, suzannevenker.com, and click on Coaching at the top. There's even a 4-session package designed to help newly married couples save their marriage before it starts by highlighting the 4 main potential stressors of every marriage. If you can resolve those now so they don't become a problem later, you're well on your way to a successful marriage. How do young people today view marriage? Of those surveyed in one National Marriage Project poll, 88% of singles agreed that there was a special person or a soulmate waiting for them somewhere out there. This same poll found that for 80% of the women polled, a husband who could articulate his deepest feelings was a better catch than one who earned a good living. This soulmate model of marriage suggests there's one unique person on the planet who connects with us by meeting our deepest longings, desires, and needs. It prioritizes skills such as the expression of feelings and the ability to spark romantic or sexual chemistry. A soulmate marriage is supposed to make you feel, in a word, happy. There's just one problem. It's a myth. The soulmate view of marriage is not conducive to a permanent commitment because it's deeply indebted to a romanticized way of thinking about love. No one person is capable of giving us great pleasure and great happiness all or even most of the time. That is why men and women who embrace the soulmate model are often left deeply disappointed by the real-world realities of love and marriage. Here with me today to discuss the soulmate myth is Bradford Wilcox, a sociologist who serves as director of the National Marriage Project. He's also a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. His research, which has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and the Today Show, focuses on ways in which marriage, gender, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the U.S. and around the globe. His website is wbradfordwilcox.com. Welcome to the show, Brad.
It's great to be here, Suzanne.
So great to talk with you. I'm really excited to talk about this subject. I've been wanting to do this for some time, and I actually touched upon this topic with my husband. We're now doing a new once-a-month Bill and Suzanne hour on this podcast, and we talked on the last segment about, just touched upon this whole concept of the soulmate and the myth of the soulmate. And I said at that time that I'm going to be having someone on to talk about that at length. So here we are, really excited. Okay, so let's dig in. This came to my attention earlier this year when you wrote an article, and then I believe you did a speech on this where you talked about, well, the title was For As Long as Our Love Shall Last, the Soulmate Myth. And I believe you've parlayed that into a book, which we can talk about later. But what I loved about it in particular was that you opened that article and talk, and I think new book, all of the above, with Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, the wildly successful book that just launched pretty much a movement. It was definitely not just a book, which was really all about Elizabeth Gilbert's approach to love and marriage, essentially. And it lit on fire. And I'm going to let you sort of explain why you use that, because it's just a perfect way to segue into this very big subject.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Right from the start of her runaway bestseller, Eat, Pray, Love, Liz Gilbert makes it clear that an older model of love and marriage is not for her. She's beginning this book by talking about how she's sobbing on her bathroom floor at 3 a.m. in her home in the New York suburbs. And it's at this moment that she gets a revelation. She doesn't want the big house in the burbs. She doesn't want the visits to big box stores with her husband, and she doesn't want the baby. So because of all these things, she leaves her marriage, divorces her first husband, and heads out on a journey to Italy, where it's about eating, to India, where it's about praying, and to Indonesia, where it's about love. And so again, in Indonesia, she finds a new man who she thinks kind of meets the bar, and his name is Jose Nunez, and he's, by her account, patient, wise, a great cook, well-proportioned, a good lover, and of course exotic to boot. He's from Brazil, and of course she's from America. So they have this powerful romance in Indonesia, and towards the end of the book, she says that they crossed over, and that is that they went on to marriage. And she later writes that marriage to Jose was, quote, a delight, a comfort, a compass, a refuge. And so, all seems great, right? But 10 years into her marriage, something happens, or perhaps someone happened, because Liz leaves Jose for a new soulmate. And of course, that's fine in her book, because in her words, I don't think marriage is supposed to be an endurance contest. And obviously that's her view. But I think what's happening here is that Liz Gilbert is under the impression that sort of love, that marriage is about kind of that intense feeling of being in love, of having that connection, of being fulfilled, being happy, kind of basically most of the time, all the time, who knows. And when those butterflies leave, she starts to, I think, look around for a new prospect, a new partner, I think, is sort of what's happening here. And so her approach, while extreme, I think, is certainly one that resonates with a lot of people out there, Jay, especially young adults who haven't actually been married. And we can see, like, in the popular culture, for instance, there are literally thousands of songs, hundreds of movies that kind of present this idea that love and that marriage are about kind of this intense emotional connection, this intense romantic connection that's supposed to make you feel good, make you happy, make you fulfilled, most or all of the time. So this is kind of the soulmate myth that's out there in large part in much of the pop culture, and is articulated by some people like Liz Gilbert in more educated precincts as well.
And what's so scary about it is that, those of us who think beyond, emotion, I guess you want to say, know that it's so not sustainable. And as a result, you're going to fall flat on your face if that is your view of love and marriage. So that gets into a big conversation about what else is necessary for marriage to last outside of that initial loving feeling that for all of us will dissipate over time or grow, hopefully, into something deeper. But that initial high, and I know people, who've actually gotten divorced and remarried chase that high. And of course, it's very sad because I wrote in one of my books that even if you marry Brad Pitt, you're going to find eventually that wears off. And I don't think people really believe me when I say that, but it really is true, because you have to get beyond that initial experience that we all have when we fall in love. So the scary part of that ethic is that, as you write, what happens, it says, you wrote here, the new ethic is love for as long as your love shall last, with love being understood that which makes you feel like you're growing fulfilled or happy in your marriage. And what do you do then when you're stuck and you realize, wow, that's not sustainable. That's not going to work this week or next week or next month.
Right.
Where's
right.
that? Yeah. So what do you do at that point? If you don't have something else to hold on to, you're kind of screwed. So you were talking about how this was in the culture, and it is big time. Another story that you brought up, which I wrote about earlier this year as well, is Marriage Story. We got the same kind of theme from that story that we do in Eat, Pray, Love. And it, of course, did very well and was discussed in terms of being, this profound story where the woman ends up realizing that she's sacrificed herself and she's lost herself. And so the only solution is to get divorced, of course, so you can go out and find yourself, which is the same theme as the Eat, Pray, Love, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the Marriage Story is a great example of the way in which, we see marriage as primarily about, or it's a vehicle that we're supposed to drive to make ourselves happy. In order to find sort of, growth and new meaning. This is sort of the Marriage Story idea, is that, the lead character played by Scarlett Johansson is not feeling like her marriage is kind of allowing her to pursue her own self's projects. And, there's no attention here, of course, given to the welfare of her son, or her husband for that matter. But really, but I think when we step back, though, from these, from the Marriage Story, or even from the popularity of Eat, Pray, Love, what's important here to realize in part is that these narratives, these stories, thankfully, are much less salient, much less kind of prevalent in the real world today than I think they were in the 70s, at the height of the divorce revolution. I was reading a book by David Frum, actually, a while back, and he talks about how there's this, these people. There's a New York publishing executive, for instance, who had this to say after he abandoned his wife for a new life in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the early 70s. He said, quote, "My marriage represents a side of me, the socially acceptable part, and I live in conflict between that side, the face that pleases other people, and what I'm learning is another part of me, a part I like better." So what you have here is this guy who's kind of coming on to this view that, again, it's all about kind of how he feels, how exciting he feels, sort of what his future holds for himself, understood in a very kind of narrow, kind of sort of therapeutic way, and with no consideration for, for his wife, for his children, and really, I think also probably no consideration for the fact that there are new chapters awaiting him. If he actually stayed with his wife and kids, there are new chapters both in his marriage, and there are new chapters as a father and as a grandfather. And by just leaving that marriage, he has closed, closed the book on all of those possibilities in ways that probably, were I to guess, and he's probably, he's probably in his 70s or 80s now, if he's still alive. There's probably a lot of regret that he took that more me-focused path back then rather than that family-focused path back then.
And not only me, but the immediate, right? The immediate versus
short-term,
the long
right.
haul, just delayed gratification. This is something that our mothers and our grandmothers understood instinctively. Of course, they lived a very different life and they matured faster and they saw war and depression and all the above. So they thought much farther out than people do today. The idea that you're going to suffer for a little bit throughout your marriage, well, not just once, maybe several times and for long periods of time, and that you come out on the other end is really foreign, I think, to the modern generation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think particularly foreign to the folks who are obviously not getting married today. But I think I think there is a lack of recognition on the part of many people who aren't married yet, and many of the people who hold themselves out as marriage experts or family experts today, or write about marriage and family life. There's kind of an inability to sort of see that marriage is about not just this intense emotional connection, and I don't doubt the importance of that, but it's also about these other classic goods. And, these are goods like, obviously, first and foremost, the welfare of your children, if you have them. But they're also goods like, financial stability, goods like both giving and receiving support from your kin. And marriage is about, many things. It's not just about that intense emotional connection. And if you lose sight of these other goods that I just mentioned, your capacity to forge a good relationship with your kids, your capacity to be financially stable when you hit retirement, your capacity to be enmeshed in a kinship network that's going to be there for you in your darkest moments, isn't going to be there.
Amen. And specific to what you just said about the issue of money and how that's just sort of, and I can personally attest to this as a marriage coach. Just, I cannot tell you the number of women who completely dismiss the fact that the men they chose to marry were not financially sound, right? Or they were not on their way, or they were still looking for themselves, or what have you, and they didn't think that was something to look for, because they haven't been taught to. And I earlier in the introduction, I mentioned a survey from the National Marriage Project poll where 88% of singles agree that there was a special person out there waiting for them, and that same poll found that 80% of the women who were polled were more concerned with a husband who could articulate his deepest feelings, and that was a better catch than one who earned a good living. That's
right.
Pretty shocking. The percentages are real. I'm surprised, and I'm not, because the number is so high, and it bears out what I'm seeing in my coaching, for sure.
Right. Although I think we have to be careful here, because I think for many of us, and this is certainly true for me personally, you kind of have a more soulmate view of marriage before the wedding day. And I think you have a more, what I call family first, or what we used to call an institutional model of marriage after the wedding day, especially once kids come along. I think particularly today, as marriages have become more stable and also more the precincts of the more privileged Americans, unfortunately, I actually think that for those who are married, especially for those who've been married a couple of years with kids, there is a growing either explicit or implicit appreciation of how much marriage is linked to financial stability. So once you have that house together, once you have that IRA, with stocks and other holdings, growing, I think this more classic concern with money that we see, articulated in the work of Jane Austen, for instance, reappears. And so I think what we're seeing play out among many, affluent Americans who are married today, as opposed to what was seen in the 70s, is that they are sticking it out in part because they know at some level that their financial future is linked to their ability to make the marriage work.
Yeah. Although my only thought is that as you're talking is, the time to sort of figure that out isn't necessarily way in. In other words, back in the day, there was a reason why people said, make sure that this person is sound financially. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And so because people aren't getting that message early on, they're sort of finding themselves having to face it after the fact. Does that make sense? So they're sort of picking up the pieces and figuring out how to maneuver financially after they're already married, when they've made a lot of decisions along the way that have not been conducive to having a strong marriage. And that's the part that concerns me. But I do think it's interesting that millennials now, and you can speak to this, they are very focused on money, a lot now before they get married, to the degree where the marriage is way off in the future and they're just focused on getting out of debt, which is a whole nother conversation.
Right.
And think that they can't get married until they're financially sound, which, it's never been that way, for one thing. You grow together and you're building something is always how it's been. And then secondly, they're bringing all this debt into their lives. And there's very few that are going to get out of that debt in time to get married.
Right. Yeah. So I think there certainly is there are two different points you're kind of making. One is that I think some young adults today are not sufficiently cognizant of the importance of finding, a spouse who is responsible, employable and financially prudent. And then there are others who are so fixated on having a kind of a middle class lifestyle that they don't get married until their late 20s or their 30s, or they're not open to finding a spouse, at age 23 or whatever, 25, when there's a perfectly great option right in front of them.
And actually, and I'd love to have you come back. I know you wrote this, I found a great article you wrote about the benefits of marrying in your mid to late 20s, which I totally agree with, and they're awesome. reasons, and that's really another subject, and I'd love to have you come back to discuss that. So I don't want to get too off onto money right now, or when to marry. But okay, so back to the soulmate. You wrote that when many Americans abandoned, an ethic of marital permanence and adopted the soulmate model, which was around the 1970s, as you pointed out, the divorce rate, of course, more than doubled. So can you talk about I consider that a self-fulfilling prophecy, but talk about the connection between the attitude and the end result, really.
Yeah, so I think the soulmate myth, again, it's this idea that marriage is primarily about an intense emotional connection that's supposed to make us happy, fulfilled, and empowered. And of course, this approach, this idea is not conducive to marital stability. And we saw a huge increase in divorce in the 1970s as this kind of more soulmate model rose to the fore. And what's interesting here is that we still see in the survey that I just did with my colleagues at the Institute for Family Studies, we did a survey in California of a couple of thousand people, and we found today that people who have the idea that marriage is about an intense emotional romantic connection are more likely to have serious doubts that their marriage will last, compared to those married folks in California who think that marriage is about romance, but also about kids, money, and raising a family together. So again, this isn't rocket science to really anyone on the in the public conversation, that people who embrace this model are more likely to get divorced. But I think or to be worrying about divorce, but I think the more, in some ways, surprising finding in the research that I've been doing with my colleagues, including Wendy Wang at the Institute for Family Studies, is that people who embrace the soulmate marriage model or embrace the myth are not only more likely to get divorced, and that's no surprise, but they're less likely to be happily married. In our data from the California Family Survey. So again, the folks who sort of have this more family-first model of marriage that recognizes marriage is about communion, about kids, about commitment, about cash, and about being part of a community that supports you and your family. People who embrace this family-first model are not only more stably married, again, no surprise there, but they're also happier on average in their marriages compared to Americans who embrace the soulmate myth.
Yeah, and I linked this to, and you wrote about this as well, the obvious answer to that is because the expectations are so different, right? When you go into something with a more realistic expectation rather than an inflated one, chances are you're going to come out much on top if you have the former view of it. So high expectations are just a gigantic problem in modern marriage. I mean, I see it, and not only do I see it, I hear it from people who, especially the older generation, when I'm talking to them about how marriage has changed, and the first thing out of their mouth is, oh my God, the expectations these young people have. It's really unbelievable. It's almost like because marriage is not needed in the traditional sense, especially for women, than it once was, we had to create some other idea for what to do with it, because we know that children need parents. So at least we've got, I think that's pretty much why people, they've always gotten married for the sake of the children. But I think that even today, even millennials, that is, they'll postpone it as long as they can. But once the kids come along, they concede that, marriage is good. And that's almost their only reason, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And we have been sort of operating in this sort of world where I think many pop cultural messages and even, many of our elites who write and talk about marriage have this idea that it's a mountaintop experience. And there's a guy named Eli Finkel, very smart family psychologist, who sort of argues that we've been able to kind of go up the Mount Maslow. And what he means by that is there's obviously a famous psychologist named Abraham Maslow. And Maslow's idea was that kind of in this contemporary world, we can focus more on things like our self-expression, our self-fulfillment, this sort of intense emotional stuff on personal growth. This was sort of the idea that Maslow had. And Finkel thinks that contemporary marriages can do this. They can focus again on the emotions, the self, personal growth. And what the assumption there is that money, again, is not that important. Maybe kids are not that important. And social support and solidarity are not important. And this is all predicated on the idea, right, that the market and the state are going to be there for you when the going gets tough.
Right.
That you can buy all your meals, at Wegmans or Food Line, or out at a restaurant, obviously, and that the state can provide support in terms of childcare, education, medical care for you, and you don't have to rely on your spouse and your kin. Okay, so you can focus just on this sort of intense emotional approach to marriage. Now, I think that there certainly has been some merit to that idea, but I would argue, particularly post-COVID, that we're learning that we can't rely on the state as much as many, I think, thought, that we can't rely upon our employer or the marketplace as we may have thought. And so at the end of the day, who's there for you? Who's in your corner? Well, for most of us, it's our family. And so I actually think that kind of coming out of this, for those who are marrying, and having kids, we're going to have a more family-first model, and it's a more stable and a more realistic model of marriage.
When you got married, things were perfect. You were both in love, and life was good. Then, somewhere along the line, everything changed. She changed, or maybe he did. Either which way, now your relationship feels, well, hard. I coach husbands and wives who feel lonely, disrespected, or misunderstood in their relationship. So many women today are desperate for their husbands to step up to the plate, to make a decision and to stick to it, to lead rather than to follow. Ladies, you have the power to make it happen. Men respond best to women who are grounded in their feminine core. As for husbands, so many of them want their wives to stop nagging and to just trust them, to smile more and to complain less, to look at them the way they did when they were first dating. Men, you have the power to make it happen. Women respond best to men who are grounded in their masculine core. The secret to lasting love rests in the masculine-feminine dance. Once you master it, your relationship will no longer be difficult. You'll be moving with the biological tide rather than against it, and that makes marriage smooth sailing. If you're struggling in your relationship, if you feel frustrated or alone, I can help. Just go to SuzanneVenker.com, that's SuzanneVenker.com, and click on the coaching button at the top. Don't wait another minute to acquire the mindset you need to find love and to sustain it. It's so much easier than you think. That's SuzanneVenker.com. Speaking of, I had Eli Finkel written down here. You just basically described it, which was great. The part and parcel of this whole concept is the idea of feelings, not only self-actualization, which you've mentioned, but also how one feels throughout a relationship, right? That if it's good, that means you're in a good relationship. And if you feel bad, or if you wonder whether or not you should have married the person, right? Or if you ever think about divorce, or if you ever have problems that seem like they're insurmountable, all of a sudden the walls come down. It's like, oh my gosh, I married the wrong person. Rather than understanding, no, this is life. And no matter who you marry, this stuff is going to be thrown your way. The challenge is to get out of it, not to question whether or not you married the right person.
Right. So the idea, obviously, is that love is not a feeling, it's a decision. And I think the problem with people like Elizabeth Gilbert is they think that love is a feeling. It's about feeling in love. That's what love is. Whereas a more classical view of love, particularly as it relates to marriage and friendship, really, is that love is a decision, that you've made a decision to be with someone and to be there for them through thick and thin, in sickness and in health. Until death do you part. And so that's a whole different way of thinking about marriage. And again, that doesn't guarantee you happiness at any one moment in time in your marriage or in your life more generally. But again, this is the sort of paradox that people like Liz Gilbert can't see. And that is that when you make your life's work to love someone through thick and thin, when you put others first, or when you try to do that on a day-to-day basis, what we tend to see in the psychological and sociological research is that you're happier, that living a generous life in your marriage as in other domains actually makes us happier. And that's what the Liz Gilbert approach can never, ever see. But anyways, the point is that it's clearly the case that her approach to relationships is not amenable to a stable marriage.
Good way to end it. I mean, and that conversation with her, that is. You also point out that the core ambition of the devotees of the soulmate model, their goal isn't to necessarily be stably married like it might be for you and me, but to be happily married. Not that we're against being happily married. I want to throw that in there.
Right. Exactly.
But there is a distinction. And what is that distinction, Brad?
Well, and here it's interesting. If you're kind of following the marriage conversation in America, one of the most, I think, clever voices in that conversation is a historian named Stephanie Coontz, a feminist historian named Stephanie Coontz. And although she doesn't explicitly embrace all of the sort of soulmate ideas, I mean, she's too smart really to do that. Her approach to thinking out loud and talking out loud about marriage is certainly kind of makes space for a more soulmate approach to marriage. She says this in her book, Marriage History, quote, "In this new model, that is of marriage, people expect marriage to satisfy more of their psychological and social needs than ever before. They want marriage to meet most of their needs for intimacy and affection and all their needs for sex. Never before in history had societies thought that such a set of high expectations about marriage was either realistic or desirable." Now, from her perspective, in truth, she thinks that this shift towards these elevated expectations about marriage in the emotional and the sexual, psychological arenas are basically a good thing. And again, there's no recognition that the fragility that they often lead to can be a real downside for couples, for spouses, and for their kids.
So you write that the intense passion and happiness we experience in romantic love fades with time for virtually everyone, which we mentioned before. And I like this part. Eventually you discover the absolutely adorable spouse you married has a temper or a weakness for credit card clothing purchases or different plans for the religious upbringing of your children than you do. And that's it's sort of like, bam, like reality goes right into the whole fantasy. And I love that, because that's what we're all about here at this show, is dealing with reality, right? And the way life really is, not the way it's portrayed in the culture and the media.
Right. And I think one of the things, too, that struck me, I mean, as I said, Eli Finkel has this very interesting book called The All or Nothing Marriage. And he does, I think, still kind of succumb to this idea that marriage is a vehicle for, fulfillment, happiness, and self-exploration. Now, he's got, again, a much more subtle understanding of how these things play out than you would see in sort of a pop cultural treatment of marriage. But there isn't, I think, an adequate recognition, and I think his title here is a tell, that there is something out there for most Americans who are married that's not the all or nothing marriage. That's sort of the in-between marriage, the good enough marriage.
Yeah.
And again, not for every part of our married life, but for much of our married life. And I think the smartest people recognize this today and are doing it. So I have, I'm quoting a woman I call Lisa Lee, a Korean American, who says that romance is not her first priority right now. She's got kids who are school-aged, and she says this: "It may sound really cold to say that it's an economic partnership, but it is in some ways. And the project of raising our children is at the moment the overwhelming priority for us until they are out of the house and financially independent." Okay, unquote. And Lee is she's not a conservative. She's actually a progressive. But she is, I think, very hard-nosed here in underlining this reality that marriage is not just about her feelings with her husband. It's about raising a family together and recognizing that if she and her husband do a good job staying together, sticking together, and focusing on their kids at this point in time, their kids will benefit. And of course, we all know that longer term, she and her husband will benefit too from having kids who are well-functioning adults, probably themselves forging good families, giving them grandkids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And of course, I agree wholeheartedly. And being in this very interesting stage of marriage myself, where we are almost empty nesters as of next year. And I think the whole concept, again, this goes back to not for the here and the now, but for forever. If you think long term, you realize that actually you can have that. A marriage has seasons, and we're going to enter a season next year where it's just the two of us again. And it's already starting to be felt because our son is very busy. He's at school or he's at work. And so the house, and our daughter's in college, so the house is empty for the first time in 20 years. And it's already starting to feel so different in a great way, that we still feel that we have the next 20 years to have that quote unquote romantic aspect sort of brought back into the fold. And so again, not so that it doesn't have to be thought of as like you have this marriage or this kind of marriage, but that it has seasons. And at the beginning, before kids, it's one way, and then you have kids and it's another, and then they leave and you have yourselves again, and then after that you get grandkids, right? It's that whole package that is just not sold, in my opinion, often enough. It's just too much of a, postpone it forever. Then once you settle down, your life's over, and then it's all about the kids, and then you die. It's like there's got to be a different framework here, a different narrative to discuss the whole of marriage, right? Not just the here and the now.
Yeah, no, and I think the short-term versus long-term perspective is often sorely lacking in the thinking of young adults today, and of course in the pop culture. So yeah, 100% agreed. And I think it's also the case too that people who have that long-term perspective on family life and on marriage end up being in a much better place financially, emotionally, socially, and family-wise, when they hit their 50s, 60s, and 70s than their peers who haven't, had that long-term mindset.
Absolutely. So real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about happiness, because you wrote something interesting. You said happiness is less likely. This goes back to, sorry to bring up Liz Gilbert again, but, she had made a statement that happiness is the consequence of personal effort. You strive for it, you fight for it, you insist upon it, and sometimes you have to travel around the world looking for it. And once you've achieved a state of happiness, you must never become lax about maintaining it. You must make a mighty effort to keep swimming upward into that happiness forever, to stay afloat on top of it. But you write, of course, that happiness is far less likely to be found when it is pursued directly, which goes a little bit back to what you were saying, I think, about what happens when you're giving to your family and how that you get
exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So I think, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm a sociologist, but my philosopher friends, tell me there's a kind of paradox of happiness argument out there. And again, that corresponds to this idea that when you don't seek happiness, when you in fact seek other goods in life, you're more likely to find it. So if you think about, a football player or a marathoner or an artist, or a writer, or a teacher, if they really cultivate the virtues that are kind of attendant to these different vocations or avocations, and pursue them, intensely and well, and become good at teaching, become good at painting, become good at running, etc., there's a kind of a happiness or a contentment that follows from the pursuit of those goods. And what I'm suggesting is that people who pursue the goods of being a good husband, being a good wife, being a good father, being a good mother, we all know that there are exceptions, but generally speaking, if you try to be a good husband, try to be a good wife, try to be a good father, try to be a good mother, you will see the fruits of that effort in a good marriage, in a good parent-child relationship, in a good family life. So that's sort of one point that I'm making, here. The second point I'm making is that, again, what I don't think Liz appreciates, what Gilbert appreciates, is that it's by dying to self, by being more generous, that we see in many domains of life that we're actually not all the time, but we're often more likely to be happy. And that's certainly true in the research that I've done with Jeff Dew on marriage. That is marital generosity. For instance, to be very concrete here, people who try to be generous towards their spouse, that generosity is actually a better predictor of their marital happiness than being on the receiving end of generosity from your spouse. It's true for both wives and for husbands. So again, both sort of seeing marriage as a place to pursue certain kinds of goods and trying to be generous towards your spouse and your kids is linked on average, to more happy marriages. And this is what a lot of the apostles of the soulmate model don't see.
Yeah. It's sometimes, I mean, I hate to simplify it, but so much of this is really just about maturity, just sort of growing up and out of yourself. And when you don't come out of focusing on yourself, you really never grow up. You really never get it. I mean, honestly, just to make it succinct,
right.
You just don't. This is why marriage is such a better road, generally speaking, for our own personal growth. Because until you are forced to face someone else day in, day out, you're really not looking at yourself and you're not growing. I mean, it requires another person there day in and day out to be able to grow. The idea that you can go off and grow by yourself, I mean, I just reject it. It just doesn't work that way.
Sure. Right. Exactly. That's exactly true. And I think, another thing that Aristotle said was we're social animals, basically. And I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but most of us really are most likely to thrive when we are in relationship to others and we're trying to be a good spouse, good friend, good parent.
Okay, so to conclude, then, is it fair to say that in lieu of the soulmate model, which you would argue and with which I agree does not work, the alternative is the family first model, which you've explained, but you can explain a little more if you like.
Yeah, so the idea here is that, I think in the 70s, there was kind of a me-first approach to married life that really took hold among many Americans. And what I'm suggesting is that for some Americans, particularly for more educated, for more religious Americans, also for many Asian Americans, there's a kind of a family-first model. It's been sort of, emerging. And this model is one that, stresses the importance of communion between the spouses, and there's a romantic piece to that, but also stresses beyond communion. I'm talking about 5 C's here. Children, is a very important concern.
Mm-hmm.
That's the second C. That stresses commitment, understood both in terms of marital permanence and fidelity. That's the third C, commitment. The fourth C is cash, kind of recognizing the importance of establishing a firm, stable financial foundation for your marriage and for your family. And attending to that in your marriage. And the fifth C is community. Situating yourself either in a religious community or in some other kind of network of friendships and family members that, basically gives honor and support to your marriage and to your kids and to your family more generally. And so people who kind of embrace all or most of those C's are, of course, more stably married, but I think this is the kicker, they're more happily married on average. And this family first model flies in the teeth of many of the arguments that have been articulated by people like Stephanie Kuntz and have been sort of embodied in, countless movies and songs, as well as books by people like Liz Gilbert. But again, people who kind of manage to put their families first in today's culture and do it in community tend to be much more happily married. And I think that's the rub, given that so much of the culture is running against doing that, even today.
Well, that's a great place to end it. Can you say those 5, just the words again of the 5 C's?
The 5 C's are communion, children, commitment, cash, and community. These are the 5 C's of a family first marriage from my perspective.
So is that going to be in your new book? I thought we could tell people a little bit about what you're working on.
I'm writing a new book called We Before Me, and it's sort of on the ways in which marriage matters now more than ever, particularly I think in a post-COVID world, and also the ways in which those who most embrace marriage are the most likely to reap the benefits of married life.
Love it. Love it. Well, I look forward to, when is that coming out? Do you know? I know how that goes.
Sometime in 2021.
Okay, so, good. Awesome.
Not sure exactly. Yep.
Great. Well, tell people, Brad, where they can find out more about your work. I know you have a website, but I also thought that, here, let me tell people for you. This is even better. I found on the National Marriage Project, where it talks about you, they have a lot of articles listed right there. Is that a good page, do you think?
Familystudies.org is probably the best place. And then also on Twitter, Wilcox NMP is also a good place to find me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Brad.
Thanks
Really
for having
appreciate
me
it.
on
Talk
today.
to you soon, I hope.
Appreciate
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And now for the email of the day. Today's email is from Cecilia. She writes, Dear Suzanne, I'm a 23-year-old woman from Sweden who recently came across your podcast. However, I have a concern that I don't find mentioned in your podcast. If I do become a young mother and have many kids and cut down my workload for years as a consequence and hence cripple my career, at least in the early stages, what happens if my future husband leaves me? What do I do if by age 50 my future husband falls in love with his assistant and leaves me? Or if I would want to leave the marriage for substantial reasons. It seems to me like I would then be in a great deal of trouble, both emotionally and financially. I would love to hear your thoughts on this issue. Okay, so I've occasionally, very occasionally, not too often, but heard from women who seem to be under the impression that I would in any way suggest that a woman not get an education, get a skill set, or pursue any job/professional endeavors that she wants, in addition to getting married and having children. I have never said such a thing or written it anywhere in 20 years. That is not what I'm about. Prioritizing marriage and putting family at the center is not an either or scenario. You don't either not get educated or have any skills and then get married and pop out a bunch of babies, or have one or two children and devote your life to your career. There's just this vast middle ground. So let it be clear, if it hasn't been until now, that I do not believe that a woman should not have a skill set or an education just because she's going to temporarily, presumably, be out of the workforce. Now, the idea that so that's that piece of it. The idea about your husband, falling in love with another person, leaving you. That was actually one of the greatest fear tactics that feminists used in the 70s to get women to stop being wives and mothers and to become, workhorses. Of course that can happen. It can happen on both sides, but you don't assume that that's going to be the result and then proceed accordingly and change your life plans over it. That makes no sense because it'll end up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, number one. And number two, if you focus on the marriage rather than assume that the marriage just sort of does its own thing while you're, raising kids or working or what have you, the chances of his or her doing that or leaving you or just, falling into someone else's arms are very minimal. Very minimal. I mean, unless you married somebody of low character who has no morals or values or what have you, it's safe to assume that if you're doing everything right and well, that's not going to happen. So again, a scare tactic that is, a reality that can happen to people. And so for that reason, you absolutely do want to get an education and a skill set so that you can take care of yourself should that arise. But it won't arise for most people if you're doing the work of putting the marriage first and making it healthy and stable. So hopefully that helps and clarifies any thought that anyone out there might have that I don't think a woman should get an education, which is just silly. Also, not to mention the fact that my whole life is a model of the in-between, that it isn't either or. It's a matter of priorities. And so why would I say otherwise when my life has been about that middle ground? So hopefully that answers your question, Cecilia. Thanks for writing. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to tune in next week when my husband joins me again for the Bill and Suzanne Hour. Also, continue the conversation on Facebook. Just type in the Suzanne Venker Show in the Facebook search bar and you will find it. Also, please recommend this podcast to one friend you think would enjoy it, and don't forget to leave us a review on whatever platform you're now using. Finally, if you have a question or comment for me, you can email me at suzanne@thesuzannevenkershow.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week.